I'm Layman Pascal, and this is The Integral Stage. Obviously, one of the biggest problems facing all of us is how to cultivate robust, ethical, convivial human beings who have their full cognitive, emotional, and motivational resources at their disposal so they can live functional, enjoyable lives, contribute to civilization upgrade, keep growing internally, and maximize the potential of their best states. That means we've got to be very curious about the psychotechnologies and philosophical maps around healing, growth, and psychotherapy. That's why I'm talking with fellow Canadian integral scholar and legit therapist. It's Durwin Foster. Hey, Durwin.
Hi, Layman.
Okay.
Excited to be here.
So, as I understand it, some of Wilber's first philosophical work was an attempt to explain how all the major schools of psychology could be simultaneously correct, which he did by connecting each of them to particular developmental fulcrums related to maturational transitions. So if that's
Right.
where integral therapy starts, where is it now? What's your current summary or feeling about what integral therapy is, what it means to you, and the kinds of things you're working on?
Sure. And just to add one piece around some of Wilber's early work that was more explicitly in therapy, because he's not a therapist per se, but he did do a specific kind of integration of Gestalt and transactional analysis. And both of those frames are still relevant in the sense of people still do have overly strong inner critics. The transactional analysis superego type person. So, a big part of my on the ground work sort of daily as a full-time therapist is, nuts and bolts, softening the inner superego, trying to get the inner superego, the inner critic, to be more of an ally than a punisher, and strengthening that, adult ego part. And, some of that kind of parts work is being brought forward, of course, into voice dialogue, also into, so I'm kind of segueing over to the other side, the Gestalt, but you could look at the transactional analysis as parts as well. But in terms of Gestalt and parts work, we can see that then taken forward into like internal family systems, as well as the voice dialogue work. And so, all of that that Ken was writing about is still relevant. What I believe in the early pieces that maybe weren't as developed, like for example, when we did, 2004, 2005, the first integral psychotherapy seminars in Boulder, I was at both of those. I would say we were underestimating trauma and attachment issues at that point. That wasn't filled out that much. It's like 15 years ago now. Both of those fields of trauma and attachment understanding, so the early fulcrums, are much more robustly understood. And there's, to me, a kind of maturation of the field in that sense. Of course, Mark Foreman just wrote a book more on trauma, and I guess used more of a narrative structure rather than some of the more systematic integral stuff. So that would be maybe another piece we could say, is that the narrative piece is built out more. We have more respect for the narrative self needing to be included in therapy. Yeah, so trauma, attachment, narrative, all those pieces maybe filled out a little more than Ken did in his early stuff. And I think we can see that now with Colin Bigelow coming, so it's public, so I can share it, but he's, put those videos out saying, hey, I had really serious trauma in childhood to the point where I had totally repressed it, but just started to have PTSD symptoms that were really bad. It's quite severe, and then, so trauma, complex trauma, starting to use those kind of frames of complex trauma, again, is more compassionate than, say, personality disorders, right? So overall increase in compassion, a little more healthy green, I would say, in the therapy world than we had right at the beginning in our understanding of integral therapy. So
Great. Well, let's get into some of those areas that are being fleshed out a little more. I had a great conversation with Mark about his book, The Monster's Journey. So obviously trauma is a huge piece of this. What is
Yeah,
it? What do you mean when you say when you say complex trauma? What do you mean, and what's an integral approach to that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm an expert trauma therapist. I work in a kind of generalist frame. But what we see is, I guess, some more enduring characteristics of, low self-esteem, worthlessness, very strong inner punishing voices, super strong inner critics, right? I'm thinking of one person I've been working with, it's almost hard to complete a sentence without the inner critic sort of interrupting, right? So a lot of like self-interrupting of oneself, one's own process, and then how to work with that. I work a lot now with just embodied presence. I mean, we try to do this on Zoom, but I do try, which is a little difficult, but I do work with embodied presence a lot in terms of, subtle energy kinds of presence. As you know, Samuel Bonder's teaching. There's another one that's a little bit out there called Crystalline Consciousness. You might want to check it out through Chris Dierkes. He's got he's got an integral frame on that.
Sure.
I think there's something to that, just based on my own understanding of energetic signatures as I experience them phenomenologically. So I think there's something there. So I definitely work with embodied presence, just a holding environment for people. Certainly work with softening the critic initially so that they can start to access their internal experience. And then I work with the, I call it just emotion focused therapy. So I've been doing more individual work than couples. So in terms of couples work, Sue Johnson's attachment work is really helpful for couples. And then for individuals, I work with emotion focused therapy, which comes from Leslie Greenberg. And he has a good model for working with anxiety and depression, where you're helping the person shift again from, kind of self-interrupting kind of way of being, where the critic is constantly intruding, or, exiled parts are constantly pushing the person into dissociation or something. He is a good way of helping move that, again, strengthening the operating ego self. Yeah, so it gives you a little bit of an idea.
Yeah. It seems to me that it's really important to have a good basic map of the dimensions of our experience for doing embodied presence, because it's very easy to say, okay, just be present, just show up, just be here now. And that's a useful instruction. But if you don't know what elements of yourself to check on in this moment, then you might be showing up only in one dimension of yourself and missing the areas in which you need to do the work.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And so if I was to think about that, and I would say that in the field, right, it tends to be, again, the field is divided. So you get people that would be more towards mindfulness. So they're really more in the head, a little bit more, or more in the witnessing self, ego, right? And then people are very somatic. And then the somatic people might not be able to potentially identify these areas very well, but they're very good at the somatic presencing. Right. And then it's also possible to have mindfulness practice that's not trauma sensitive, where people then are kind of disconnecting and they think that they're going into mindful witness, but they're actually dissociating. Right. And so there is some trauma sensitive mindfulness work out there. Actually, that was the guy that went to graduate school, has published that book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. So he's doing some really interesting work on that. Just, how do we distinguish when someone's moving into a mindful witness as a healthy witnessing, or when is somebody, dissociating, and sort of, which isn't, they're re-traumatizing in a certain kind of way, or just at least not making any progress.
What are the kinds of things you see, like when somebody's dissociating versus doing a healthy disidentification procedure? How does that show up differently? Like, what would you look for to indicate that it was one or the other of those?
Could be tension in the body. Again, we see this kind of, you can see, people just lose focus, right? So there's sort of space out, zone out. So, you can say, hey, where were you? At that point, that kind of thing. What's going on for you right now? So either tension in the body or a kind of space out, zone out would be a couple of things that I would see in particular. Yeah, and I guess, part of the challenge of the context that I've been working in also is that this is, I guess, the lower right quadrant, is that we are actually don't have a mandate to do trauma therapy. We're supposed to do, so this just gets into the healthcare system, we're supposed to do short-term stuff. So I'm a little bit conflicted about doing that kind of trauma work with people and how much to go into it in depth. Yeah, because I'm not working in a private practice setting right now with, wealthy clients necessarily. I've done that before. That's not what I'm doing right now. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I guess you would say the lower right quadrant is more the system, what's available to the person, then the system is also determining what I'm doing.
You mentioned anxiety a couple times in your earlier remark, and I'm very curious about the nature of anxiety. I know that one of my favorite therapy books is Ego, Hunger, and Aggression by Fritz Perls. And in that book, he says, anxiety is excitement minus oxygen, which it's very provocative, kind of useful, but obviously a little bit too narrow to describe the real situation. What's your take? What is anxiety, and what are the basics for how we deal with it well, or better anyway?
Yeah, I would say, that's a little bit, I would say that's coming from somebody that hasn't struggled with a lot with anxiety. Anxiety has been an issue for me. So I had separation anxiety in particular as a kid. So I think for people that haven't struggled a lot with anxiety, then you could look at it like through a lens like that, and I've seen myself sometimes make similar sort of too narrow lenses when I talk about addiction, because that hasn't been so much my challenge, right? But for someone who's really struggled with addiction, some of the narrower frames on addiction would seem a little bit, uncompassionate, right? So, yeah, so I mean, it's at some level, it is a kind of avoidance of experience. I mean, that's, actually, I wrote a little article on this on Medium called Integral Inquiry for Anxiety. So it is some kind of avoidance of experience in one or other quadrant or level or line or state, right? It's an allergy, something we don't want to feel. So that's, I think that would be probably the most concise definition.
I read that article. I liked the breakdown of avoiding feeling, avoiding moving, avoiding relationship, avoiding service.
Yeah,
I was a little suspicious about whether serving was the right way to frame the lower right, but maybe you could take us through those 4 zones and give us a sense of
for anxiety,
what those 4 avoidances are. Yeah, for anxiety.
Well, and I would nuance it a bit now in the sense that, again, in the relational side, I think you need to look at attachment specifically. And, I would recommend for anybody that's serious about, and this again comes out of my own experience in part, but anyone who's serious about, really the relational quadrant of their life, if they've had any challenges in that area, you could do a full AAI, adult attachment interview. It's kind of a gold standard interview, kind of at the level of, say, one of the other sentence completion tests that are really popular in the integral space. But this one, sort of gets at the attachment dynamics, which are in place before our narrative self is really online, but can be sort of inferred from how people respond to these interview questions. So I think that's worth kind of knowing, and it also assesses for trauma pretty well, actually. So I just briefly a shout out for kind of gold standard assessment kind of stuff in this field for the relational part of your anxiety, right? So avoiding relating then would be related to either a dismissive attachment style, right? Or there's sort of a inverse of that where there's still a lot of anxiety, but it's more of like a preoccupied, where I'm wanting to always check, am I kind of okay with that person? reflecting after, oh, maybe I didn't respond properly. Do they still like me? There's sort of the relationship is living on as a form of anxiety in my mind, even when I'm not connected at the moment. So that's called preoccupied or anxious attachment style. So those would be two sort of forms of anxiety or avoidance. I'm just trying to reflect on how I would think about the preoccupied one as an avoidance behavior. I would imagine that there's some unresolved early feelings, right, that could be contact around some of those early attachment. They'd be just very somatic, uncomfortable feelings.
They're avoiding an experience of internal intensity relative to previous patterns. But how do you, what do you do with that? Like, how do you make that, what is healthy attachment, and how do people shift toward that from one of those two?
Yeah, absolutely. So secure attachment is, kind of, we do want to get there, because then we, can have good relationships and not either be anxious about them all the time, checking, texting our partner, annoying them endlessly, that kind of thing, clingy, what they would call, or just, an island unto ourselves, not really interacting, withdrawing on the couch, that kind of thing. Stan Tatkin calls it the wave and the island are the two. The island is the ambivalent, the wave is the anxious, and the secure he calls the anchor. So in terms of how to shift that, one, I know a specialized expert, and there's the book Adult Attachment Disturbances, Dan Brown and David Elliott. David Elliott's a friend of mine, so I can talk to him. But the way I work with it with people is I work with their protocol, which is through visualizing and trying to feel it as well, using whatever channel we can to basically visualize that, what they would call a just right interaction from the parental figure. So visualizing their parent while you're imagining yourself as a child, then visualizing your parent figure responding in just the right way according to the early attachment needs, which include, of course, felt safety and protection at the most basic physical level, physically safe, but also emotional attunement, so you feel seen and known by your caregiver. They're reflecting back to you your own emotional state in a way that's congruent, but also kind and compassionate, that they can support your best self, so they can help you also then, once you're safe, to go out and explore, right? So they can recognize and amplify your strengths. That they're what they call express delight, that they're happy to have you around. And you come in the door, they're, hey, how was your day, right? They're not either preoccupied with themselves or dismissive, not caring about you. So those sorts of parameters or conditions for secure attachment. So I go through those. There's a psychoeducation piece of just familiarizing people that, hey, this is what optimal parenting looks like. And then start to then build, okay, if that was the case for you, if you had that optimal, what would that look and feel like? What might be the facial expression of the parent? What might be their body language? And start to build that, or what might you feel like?
Right.
Sometimes they do a little somatic anchoring, from like EMDR, or they use, or the resource tapping, just tapping on the legs. You can do bilateral tapping, while you're visualizing to sort of anchor it in a little bit. Yeah, bring in a little kinesthetic, so visual, auditory, kinesthetic kind of thing.
So you're kind of, you're midwifing people's ability to give themselves the somatic, emotional, and mental modeling of the early relationships upon which their subsequent attachment patterns would be based.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's the anxiety as it shows up in the lower left. And then in terms of the upper right, I would say this is good because I don't always get to go through it in a comprehensive way like this. in the upper right, what I've been working with is that we would kind of broadly call self-regulation, right? Or avoidance behaviors. So avoidance behaviors would be then, I guess, where someone's life is shrinking down. So acceptance and commitment therapy really works at on that really well. So that's Stephen Hayes' work, acceptance and commitment therapy, where he found that as much as possible, and of course, I mean, this kind of fits with pearls and it's sort of common sense, feel the fear and do it anyway kind of idea. Particularly if there's something you're not doing that's a strong value to you, right? Summoning the courage to still move forward on your values, even though you're trembling and shaking and having these very uncomfortable symptoms, which can be really uncomfortable though, right? With panic anxiety and stuff that, you know, really unpleasant for people. So that would be the behavioral avoidance piece. But then the self-regulation piece, I feel, is working with breath practice, right? So, you know, from the most simple one, which is actually really effective, the lengthening the out breath, just lengthening the out breath. I actually saw someone was selling a little tube now that you could have around your neck. Did you see that? You could put it up and remember to slow down your out breath and have a nice long out breath.
No, I haven't seen that, but when I was a kid, I used to like to chew on straws, and I would just I would pretend I was smoking, but I would just be breathing in and out through the straw.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, especially so, you know, the breathing out, the long, slow out breath. So 4 by 8, in for 4, out for 8, is one of the most sort of rapid ways, right? You're just changing the sympathetic and parasympathetic balance through, you know, more on the brake. So again, some psychoeducation people about the gas and the brake of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. We activate the sympathetic a little bit on every in-breath, and we deactivate it, or we put on the brakes on every out-breath. So lengthening the out-breath is a really good way to calm down fast.
So in that upper right zone where sort of movement is the anchor, there's the movement of breath, there's sort of full use of the body, there's the ability to reach out for the things you need, there's all that post-Wilhelm Reich body therapy about being able to manifest your feelings in form. But there's also, it seems to me, like, you know, when you talk about self-regulation, just physical health seems to make so much of a difference, right? Like exercise and diet. And if your blood is circulating right and your organs aren't working right, you're going to have anxiety just from your physical condition to some degree, right?
Yeah, that's true. And we do have, so in our program, we do have people come in with chronic pain and chronic physical situations. And we sort of segment that out a bit. So we have like an occupational therapist who works a little bit more with that side.
Okay.
Has a little bit more of that medical understanding. But there is one kind of biomarker that I think could potentially provide a kind of bridging from that medical to the psychological, which is the HRV, heart rate variability. And all the work that's being done on that now, and it's a lot. I mean, I'm sure there's a number of biomarkers coming along.
Yeah.
But that's one that's certainly a good one to have. There'd be the brain ones as well. But heart rate variability is a good one. And, you know, and then we can train that through a different kind of breath practice called resonance breathing. One of the guys one of the people working on this is David Lowenfels, who has some integral understanding, and he's also quite scientific. He comes out of MIT. He's got a device for, you know, there's a number of these now, but, you know, heart rate variability device you can use. But just practicing with the resonance pattern, which is then more like a 5 to 6 breaths a minute. Somewhere in there will be your zone where you sort of get into this resonance pattern, where you're actually strengthening, they call it the barrel reflex. Again, I'm not a physiologist, so I'm a generalist across these 4 quadrants, I'd say. But you can, if you practice in that zone, you can increase your heart rate variability, which is kind of like, again, a metaphor is just like kind of the responsiveness of your car, right? You can accelerate quickly to get out of a bind. You can put the brakes on quickly, you know, so that you stop at the intersection, don't go through the intersection. The higher your heart rate variability, the more like that responsive vehicle you are. And so, yeah, so with some clients, if they're kind of interested in that, I try to get a sense of sort of what zone is sort of going to respond, they're going to respond to. So I'm trying to individualize as much as I can. And yeah, I'm working with one client right now where he likes that idea quite a bit, heart rate variability. So then again, I'm going with that practice.
Yeah, I've tried a few heart rate variability apps where you just put your fingertip on.
Yeah, there's some fingertip. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know. Yeah, there's some, yeah, whether those are kind of medical grade yet or whatever. Anyway, what Lowenfeld suggests is, it's really, are we doing the practice too of the resonance breath? But he has a device that's not that expensive that, clips onto the ear, and then you see the visual, and you can do that.
It fascinates me that, in some of the literature I've read on that, right, that people end up with an insufficient degree of chaos in their heart rhythm to some degree, right? You're getting coherence, but you're also getting it rich enough that if the heart rate variability starts to get too simplistic, then your system is in jeopardy.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't looked into much beyond that, but
Yeah.
I was fascinated by the idea that it's got to be like fractally rich enough in order to be operating properly.
Okay. I haven't looked into all the science of it. Lowenfels is very much up on it. There's some interest, that I have seen some articles again, how much is diagnosis helpful, but they may have an HRV marker for PTSD possibly, or at least part of it, the upper right quadrant, right? Because none of these approaches are I don't think we don't really have an academia right now, right? Where everybody starts by looking at all these first person, second person, and third person perspectives, and, designs research studies to look at all of that at once, which would be cool. Probably would take teams. It'd have to have both that map and networks of researchers, right? Because no one's going to be good enough.
Yeah.
Across all those areas either.
I'm thinking of a typically insightful and dismissive Adi Da comment where he said, most of your so-called spiritual problems are really just lunch. Right, but there's a lot of our internal situation is very closely linked to whether we're getting sleep right and what we're eating and those sorts of things. They're very,
sleep is really important. Sleep is really important. I do some sleep hygiene stuff with people. I've done a little bit of dream work. Joseph Dillard has a pretty interesting dream work methodology. It's kind of like a voice dialogue with the dream characters.
So what about feeling avoidance in the upper left?
Yeah, so feeling avoidance in the upper left. So I called it feeling. I mean, you could be avoiding sensation. I mean, you could even be avoiding thoughts. I don't see why you couldn't, but certainly the feeling as an overall sort of gestalt of what's going on for you in the upper left, or knowing your own experience. So I'm just tuning into that right now as it bounces around a little bit. So yeah, so I work with, so there's two ways of doing it, right? And the way that I initially learned was more along the lines of VAKT. So like Shinzen Young's approach was how I learned meditation, for example. And he really works with sensation, emotion, visual images, visual thoughts, right? And then, of course, all the external mindfulness of sound and so on. But he works with those as sort of kind of like levels. But in a certain kind of way, that's a little too cognitive, or maybe a little bit reductionist to the upper right or Abhidharma view or something like that. But I do recommend his work. It's really good because he's very good at teaching it, of how to then, so avoiding experience, the way you overcome that is you just see, okay, am I feeling good about, can I feel all my body sensations right now, and just really feel into them, right? Because if you're avoiding something, if you really feel into it for a while, you might move through that avoidance, right? And then the emotional channel is kind of an in-betweener. energy and motion, right? That you can kind of focus, do a mindfulness of emotion, really just feel emotion. There are, some of the embodiment stuff works with this idea of inhabit, and Corey's got one of the embodiment teachers on there, Ryan, doing more of the inhabit. It's hard for me to know quite if that's a metaphor or whether there is really a shift you can do like that. That's more like actually inhabiting, but it could be. So, you can work with that metaphor of really inhabiting the feet, really inhabiting the belly, really inhabiting the heart, inhabiting the head. Yeah, emotions, and then, thoughts and visual imagery. But then there's also, I would say, I would like to make that more developmental. And that's sort of my edge now, is to make that more developmental in practice, right? Because I have the developmental piece in theory, but in practice with clients, again, it's not that well accepted. It's still not in mainstream. It's really not there, actually.
That's an interesting area, like the question of what is emotional intelligence, because often that gets treated very in a very simplistic way, just like people who are very sensitive and empathic are more emotionally intelligent. But emotional intelligence as an expanded concept, meaning how are we more emotionally robust? How are we more nuanced? Can we have emotions about things we didn't know we had emotions about? What's the developmental dimension of emotion? Like, what's your general take on what is emotional intelligence and how can we get better at it?
Okay. Yeah. So, well, I think in practical terms, you see the most common. So anxiety can be then not an authentic feeling, but more secondary to, right? We don't want to feel particularly sadness, right? Because often it's not there's no social context to feel sad either, right? Or not a very strong one. So certainly working with sadness is a big part of, on the ground counseling, right? Around loss experiences in particular. So normalizing sadness so that people aren't dissociating, repressing their sadness and then being anxious, right? Because they're dissociating from it. And it goes back to Jung's statement, neurosis is the, Neurosis is the product of avoided suffering, something like that. This escapes me right now, but he's got some quote like that, which is a pretty good summary. But sadness, anger is the other one. So working with anger. So again, how did people learn to be with anger? Did they learn to stuff it? Do they project it? Do they act it out in destructive ways? Of course, that's a problem, social problem if it's acted out that way. But it can also be, some of that older ideas I still believe are true. If you stuff the anger, that is a part of contributor to depression.
So the basic level of emotional intelligence is
that.
Yeah, it's like recognizing them, feeling them, letting them all in, and then looking for patterns in how you've related to them and how you're manifesting them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I guess a lot of the work I'm doing is, more at those basic levels because that's the everyday level where people are struggling most of the time. That are coming in the system, in the medical system looking for help. They didn't have that growing up. But also, I do think that's an issue in the integral context as well, that there's people, bouncing around with, there was, some stuff on there. There's that one fellow who's kind of got a narcissistic streak, right? Using the developmental models as in sort of fascistic way. So that's, again, that comes back to that early attachment stuff and early relational conflicts and the not being able to process the emotions related to those.
One idea I had a while back was, I've been thinking about Robert Kegan's notion of a kind of looping model of development where the the subject of one stage is the object of the subject
Right.
of the next stage. And I thought, what's the correlate of that on the emotional intelligence line? And I started trying to think, what's a second order emotion? And it's interesting that a lot of spiritual systems do involve sort of, it's like, I'm okay about feeling sad, so I can be present with it, or I'm unhappy about my reactive manifestations, or right. There's a lot of the maturational systems involved having emotions about emotions.
Right. Yeah. So that's true. And so I call that a meta emotion. And that, certainly like with panic anxiety, it's the fear of the fear. There's sort of that. There's a evaluative aspect of the fear, like, gosh, this is really terrible. And, so the self-talk, and there's, ways to work with self-talk and anxiety, particularly the what if. The what if is the big, the what if is the sentence stem that's, most correlated with anxiety.
Right.
But I guess what I wanted to talk about a little bit would be, and I'd say it would tie in to the emotional, would be what Ken has developed around full spectrum mindfulness as a kind of simultaneous waking up and growing up practice. And so then we're identifying, rather than just working with sensations, emotions, thoughts, that kind of category system, we're working more specifically with developmental material in the sense of safety, security, survival, food, relationship to food, relationship to sex and romance, relationship to power, relationship to belonging, relationship to achievement, and so, and through the rest. But again, in therapy, we're often working with the issues in those first levels and trying to kind of restore those. So yeah, so mindfulness of those, of those developmental territories, and where, what might be going on for us around that. So, and then it's about, so it's more psychodynamic, right? Am I fixated and arrested? Have I got an addiction to food, or have I got an allergy to food, right? If I got an addiction to sex, or if I got an allergy to sex, my sex drive or my romance drive. And so, yeah, so working with that. And in his practice, what he does is have you toggle from a kind of an open state. So it's a kind, or a pendulation, which actually comes out of trauma therapy. You pendulate from some kind of open state practice, like something I like the do nothing, or the practice of no problem, or, something like that. Or you could, for clients who maybe don't have as much experience meditating, could just be focusing on the breath or some kind of grounding. And then pendulate from that to the more emotional laden material. So also fear of death, right? So pendulate from that, then from this open state to open monitoring or something, to really allowing in everything around your fear of death.
Right. So you're going back and forth between your okayness and your disturbance.
Exactly. Yeah. And Ken has built this out, and he's got this whole program on integral life. And I did the program, and then he's actually started to do chunk by chunk as well, like, deep dive on body, a deeper dive on sex, deeper dive on power. But that's an interesting kind of practice to me. It'd be interesting to work with that with like a community that wanted to do that, and see what kind of comes out of it. It's an interesting concept of using that kind of pendulating back and forth, which kind of comes from trauma therapy. But yeah, going from that okayness into the difficulty back to the okayness. Hopefully the consciousness is kind of learning from the contrast a little bit somehow. Yeah, I don't know what your reflections are on that, but
well, I've got a few, but let's shift into that lower right, which you put as avoiding serving.
Yeah, well, because I was just thinking in economics, right? The service economy, and then we had the industrial economy, but that would be, broadly speaking, I guess, also knowledge work and anything like that. Just whatever our ecological niche is.
Yeah, it seems like in that zone,
roles.
Some people are super identified with certain functional protocols, and other people are very hesitant about those protocols. right? Like my mother has a very difficult time in lineups at the border, right? It's very personal for her. She has a difficult time staying just in the line and going through. She has to, make an issue out of it. Somehow this functional process is a difficulty for her.
Yeah.
And I get, it's always legitimate. I get where she's coming from, but I always want to say to her, look, just keep your mouth shut and stand in line. Own the protocol, and we'll get through this smoothly.
Yeah.
That's a kind of serving, right? You're submitting to a process.
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. Your role, that's a part of your citizen role, right? They have you're being a good citizen, respecting their citizen processes. And yeah.
Seems like a lot of people right now, and because there's very
legitimate frustration.
Yeah, there's very legitimate crisis of trust about our institutions and our social, legal, and economic systems. So that's all quite legitimate. But a lot of people feel very, let's say, alienated from the civic processes that we've established, right? And some of that's reasonable. There's a lot of bad processes, but at the same time, there's a kind of anxious, neurotic distancing from the systems in which we need to participate in order to get things done.
Well, and this may take us off the track if there's a difference between Canada and the US, what's happening that way, but there's certainly some cultural differences. Like it seems like we're a little bit further down the postmodern road here in Canada, but that may not be true, but it kind of seems that way, I would say. But yeah. So relationship to roles and processes and governance, I guess, is a big piece of that, right? And dynamics that can go sideways and intersect with some of these early fulcrum rule mind stuff, like so Amber, I guess, kind of stuff around, where if it goes sideways and you get victims and perpetrators and rescuers as kind of a system dynamic, and people playing those roles and that causing problems. So I guess the first step is to identify those, right? That's happened, for people to own that maybe they were emotionally hijacked and started to play one of those not so helpful roles. Yeah, I'm just kind of brainstorming this because, again, I don't always try to go through each quadrant in one conversation. But but in therapy, I will go use all ones, but I don't use all of them with every person at this point. I don't have a mandate that we're doing integral therapy, and I don't have a context of peers also, where everybody's kind of familiar with working with all those zones. But I would say that just look at that drama triangle, right? And then you can try to flip those roles. So you flip the victim, goes to, co-creator, I think, creator. So you're trying to tap into agency, being creative. The persecutor is flipped into a challenger. So you see it as a challenge, or you're challenging that person rather than attacking them. And then the rescuer becomes a coach, right? So there's a way to sort of change those roles into more healthy lower right quadrant or system roles, you could say. And I realize I'm using the lower right quadrant in the sense of social system more than hard physical lower right quadrant of like.
I think that's reasonable. Like
Okay.
when we think of the hard physical aspect of the lower right, it starts to be the upper right pretty quickly.
Okay, yeah, it's tricky in there.
I think of it more as systems and protocols, which are, plural and objective rather than objects themselves.
Okay.
It's interesting, relates a little bit to the avoidance of feeling, but the difficulty people have in empathizing with all of the different roles that are part of their system. Right? And there's sort of a shadow element, right? Like some people, they don't like the beggar, or they don't like the capitalist, or they don't like, there's all these roles that are part of the system in which we operate, where different groups of people and different individuals have a hard time emotionally connecting with that. And that might be holding back their own ability to work constructively within a system.
That's a good point. I certainly think postmodern, then supervisors would feel conflicted. Yeah. Like if people are in a supervisory role, in the one hand, they've still, at least in say Vancouver, I better not talk too much about my employer though. They're a good employer, actually. If you look on their, their ratings, they're, consistently very highly rated employer, and they treat people fairly. And I think there's just a little bit of that postmodern double bind. It's like, I want to be egalitarian, but I'm still actually, have the authority to hire and fire people. So that's a bit of a bind for the, the postmodern mind to work through. And I don't know exactly how we work that through. Maybe you have some thoughts about that, but probably something like evolving to holacracy, something like that will be hopefully where things would evolve to.
I mean, there's an interesting question around what sorts of systems would benefit our development and psychological health more so than the current one that we're in. But I had one other thought this morning about the lower right, which is Jordan Peterson often has this rant about scheduling. And
Really?
understanding schedules as something, it's a way of getting the things you want to get done. Right. And so there's a kind of
a lot of
process.
So I'm terrible with scheduling.
Right. So that we think, a lot of people feel very reactive about scheduling, like it's an imposition upon what they spontaneously want to do, where it could be conceived, you could take ownership of it in a way where you think, this is a way for me to get the things I want done. It's a list of what I want to do. It's not something somebody else wants from me, right? So there's a shift from dissociation to ownership in terms of, a process, in terms of a systemic approach.
Right. Yeah, and I try to solve that one through software, like just getting, because I have to serve, it's my responsibility to serve my clients and got to set up appointments. But there might be more nuanced ways to work with that. Certainly having really good software would be good. Maybe the AI calendaring software, if that got more.
If it's not in my Google Calendar, your birthday does not get remembered by me.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is a whole systems piece on more of the hard systems of like software and that's actually really relevant to my job and to everybody's roles these days, right? But I just, and there is anxiety about that too, actually. And or fixation, you can become sort of addicted to it and like super keen about it, overly enthusiastic about technology, or gosh, I hate technology, it scares me, or I just really don't like it, I can't figure it out. Yeah, so.
Let's segue from.
Yeah, we'll do a lot of that in therapy.
To like the social systems that could empower psychological health, because, we got there's some problems with postmodern systems, and yet the postmodern systems, the slightly more socialist countries seem to be doing a lot better with the crises than the less socialist countries. There's a lot of critique on both sides, right? There's critique of imbalanced capitalism. There's critique of imbalanced socialism. There's critique of regressive. There's critique of progressive. There's critique of centrist. What are the therapeutic insights into the kind of system we could have that would be better for our development and health?
I don't know if I can make a therapy insight into a political system that would be most helpful, other than, generally we would say, people having access, to good therapy. I guess for leaders to do their own therapy when they need to do that would be really helpful. For us to be able to identify bad actors better in systems would be really important. So like when does the leader have a complex trauma issue, right? And there might be some distinctions between that, and also then maybe there's another level of like dark triad stuff. I don't quite necessarily, I'm not an expert on all that, but like, is dark triad just a symptom of complex trauma, or is this kind of its own thing, or is like actually kind of evil? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe just to call it all complex trauma. But sort of being out for systems to get better at recognizing complex trauma person who walks in the door
Yeah.
would be actually really important, both to protect the system from undue resource allocation. Like, you know, yeah, if a client has a complex trauma issue, they can take up a lot of bandwidth. You know, you can end up with 10 meetings of all the counselors trying to sort out how to help this person. And same if you get someone with complex trauma in a leadership role, a professor or a CEO or someone in senior management or something. They can make life miserable for years for their students, for the for the employees. So I guess that's one contribution of psychology to that field. Yeah, in terms of the system itself, I think we would still be looking at something like digital democracy. We've talked about that stuff before, but it's a little bit out of the range of therapy, I would say.
I saw an interesting study the other day about perceptions of leadership and narcissism in, I think, kindergarten students. So the kids were asked who they thought had leadership qualities, and then they were put into groups, and those people had to lead the groups. And of course, the narcissists were bad leaders, right? The group did not function well under narcissistic guidance, but most of the kids interpreted the narcissist as having leadership qualities, which adults still seem to do to some degree in our democracies. Wow. What do you make of that?
I have to look at that study. I guess it's the dominance traits. The kids are picking up on dominance just at the biological level pretty early. And somehow it's a dominant submission thing, right?
But that's then interesting if those kids are growing up to be adults and that perception of leadership isn't evolving, isn't changing, that they're remaining basically infantile in the way we calculate who's a good leader.
Yeah, I mean, we're still growing out of that, right? If we had grown out of that, at least if the US had grown out of that, Trump would never have got elected. I mean, he would just, would realize that. So I think where I would go with that would be around, like, maybe for men, around the father wound in particular, right? And for young boys and girls to have, I guess, dads who are, able to set some boundaries and also loving. So that's the, I guess, come back to parenting, I think, more than, again, as a therapist, don't have that much to say about, what kind of democracy system, but parenting, good parenting for those kids so they can start to work that out. Again, and I think that Cobra Kai show, again, because it's so much about that mentorship and the father wound, and they're trying to work all that out in that show and doing a pretty good job about it, actually, in the sense that, trying to discern what strength looks like. But then, at the beginning of the show, there's no mercy. So you got no love, no compassion, right? Just strength, right? And so, gradually the main dojo leader is trying to, really figure out what's a bad father, right? Which is his old sensei. What's the good father?
Yeah.
It's got to be strong enough, right? But also has compassion.
Other than, Fight Club and martial arts movies, there aren't a lot of cultural images of male mentorship in a developmental sense. And so I'm curious about your take on healthy masculinity. Like, what's new in our sense of masculinity that's necessary and good that we need to add in? And what things from our classic ideas of masculinity do we still need to keep because they're also good and healthy and necessary?
Yeah, well, I don't think I've totally sorted this out for myself. I feel that I've been fortunate to have some really good mentors, like male mentors. Like I had many years of mentorship from a kind of kick-ass psychologist. Like he was a kick-ass guy and also very loving and compassionate, and he kind of reparented me as an adult. I was very fortunate to have that. And then, I've had some support from Ken over the years, kind of a kick-ass dude. So I've had some of that. And so fortunate to have that. kind of provided. And so we want to offer that to other young men, certainly my son, any other young men. And yeah, I don't feel like I'm quite done. I think we're trying to sort that out a bit. Like, for example, the Bruce Springsteen thing that just happened, right? I had a kind of visceral reaction of like, here's this, classic kind of rugged but kind male. So in a lot of ways, it looks like pretty healthy to me. His video was certainly like that. Let's meet in the middle. He's trying to bridge the divides. And I don't know if you saw that or this whole story thing.
No, I didn't see this.
Didn't check it after, but anyway, he got canceled. And so, I was pretty conflicted about that. I was quite angry. I said, well, they're canceling Bruce Springsteen. You can't cancel Bruce Springsteen. I mean, that's sacrilegious, right? Or like, you might as well just punch every blue collar guy in the face right now, like, well, what do you think you're doing? It's ridiculous. So there's part of me is thinking that, that's terrible, it's, and then someone else said, well, this is his third DUI. Oh, well, shit, you can't be doing that. Right. So at least not 3 times. I mean, the third time apparently he had 1 drink. It was a 0.2 or something, which is really low, right? Like this is getting into the zone of like,
it's debatable at that point.
It's debatable. It's into the postmodern zone of moral purity, right? Where someone would jump on, basically like an amber version of postmodernism. But third time, well, okay, now that's a problem, right? So I just kind of think that's where we're at. And I don't know who's got, I'd like to see, us work this out. Maybe you've got it sorted out. I mean, in the integral, there's like there's a little bit more embodied versions, like the embodiment conference and with Mark Walsh, right? And then you get the little more stoic versions, like the Stoa, Peter Lindbergh, right? And you get a little bit more on the body side, a little bit more on the mind side. I know somehow we got to put all that together.
Yeah, we've got to put it together in a way that really makes real and vitalizes the different perspectives that we're trying to hold. Earlier, when I mentioned Fritz Perls' definition of anxiety, you said it sounds like somebody who hasn't struggled with anxiety said that, right? And that's a very interesting thing because the philosophical mental integral map nominally includes all these dimensions of being. But there's superficial ways like, we include that. I acknowledge it, but I haven't gone through that. So I don't actually know the reality of what I'm acknowledging. So how do we make the integral universe real in these zones and not just technically including them? Yeah.
I guess, even at the technical level, I mean, talk to people who really specialize in an area, right? So, we still need specialists and, like my friend who's the psychologist attachment specialist, like he's really dialed that in. So, because not only is there issues at the attachment level, there's actually a whole other level called conflict themes or something, conflictual relationship themes, right? And so there's another level of relational issues. And so, so there's a whole subject area there. And so not to presume that just because we've got the integral map that we're going to be really dialed in on certain areas. So that's one piece. For example, I felt like with addiction, maybe I didn't quite get it because it hasn't been as much of my lived experience. So that's, I think, one piece of just having, I guess, enough people to make a kind of network. It's going to be, we need kind of networks, I think, of people that there's no one person that's going to have all these pieces.
Yeah.
So, and, for example, in the addiction field, there is, I think, Guy Duplessis and John Dupuis, who've kind of probably got more of the lived experience of that, but then also using the integral map, they would be, work with them more rather than, for me, for example, rather than presuming that I can sort of dial that in.
My emotional and cognitive style is that I tend to see a lot of possible pathways in things right up front. And so taking personality tests.
Do you need 7 maybe? I don't know. Anyway. type
When I've been with counselors in my life, which is not very often, or when I've taken personality profiling tests, I have a whole, what does that exactly mean? That could mean this. I see 4 or 5 different ways it could go, that kind of thing. And I always thought, boy, it would be great if somebody knew that about me, if they could rephrase it a little bit so that I didn't have to worry about whether or not the structure of their question was correct prior to being able to check myself. And so talking about integral therapy, I wonder how much you're aware of nuancing the language for people who seem to be at different levels or different styles of processing.
I certainly try to do that intuitively. It would be nice to have development on the map in my workplace, would be great. At the same time, we need to be really cautious about that because, for example, we've only just now got, again, upper left, all this stuff with David Long and stuff, you can get into idealism in the upper left, and then that can become either fascistic or narcissistic or something like that, right? And I see that better now than I did when I first got into integral stuff. So and then you can temper that a little bit by saying, okay, I really got to see what's going on in the upper right and get a correlate. And then once I got that correlate, then, okay, now I got a foundation. And so I just saw some research now on moral development and brain. And it's really the moral development where the rubber hits the road. And I saw some brain research on moral development where they actually found correlates in the brain for the higher stages of moral development, which is really cool. And this is a bit of a digression. I don't use this in therapy, but just to say, it would be nice to have all of that included kind of explicitly in a therapy team. I'm not working within that right now, but the people are open, and I also, got lots to learn. So how do I do it? I like assessments sometimes to help me get a sense of what's going on, but I tend to also, I'm quite willing to go off script as soon as you use it as a launching pad for our conversation. Particularly, like I have one person who's like you were saying, is I can see 4 or 5 ways this can go. Usually that's a high intelligence person, and there are all these perspectives, and and this person was like that. So we just use it as a launching off point, to go into whatever is most important.
Here's a seeming tangent, but years ago, I saw the Dalai Lama at the University of Victoria. And I was sitting at the back, and right behind me was the news camera, which had a little blinking red light on the camera. So he came out, he was with 3 or 4 guys in suits who sat there very formal, and he came out and really planted himself in his robes. It was great. And from where I was sitting, the little red light behind me was blinking exactly on the bridge of his glasses. So for the whole 2 hours, there was a blinking red light in the middle of his forehead, as far as I was concerned. It was great.
Third eye was lit up.
Yeah. I'm wondering what you think in terms of psychology, which Buddhism has a very rich tradition of. What is it you think they're lacking that contemporary psychotherapy or integral therapy can bring into it? What are the Buddhists not doing?
Oh my! I don't know if I say I'm an expert on Buddhism. I mean, I guess there was some early controversy around the self, right? And I did have a number of discussions with Ken around that along the way, and so I guess Abhidharma view of the self, and this is in SES too, right? Abhidharma view of the self of sort of no self as being potentially getting us into kind of a nihilistic perspective, right? Whereas then the idea that the relative self is real. I guess that would be more of a problem with some forms of Buddhism in terms of therapy. So I think in terms of therapy, we do want to work with the relative self being relatively real. Otherwise, we're going to tend to do a spiritual bypass or dissociate. So I would say that. So it's important but I feel that I was thinking, I guess when you talk about the Dalai Lama, because that was part of my context in graduate school. was the research conferences. The Dalai Lama at least had his name on. And early on in all that kind of neurodharma stuff, they said, you know, there isn't a self that, you know, because, you know, we can't find it in the brain. Right? It's like, it's not in the brain. It's in your mind. It doesn't mean it's not unreal, right? So, but that they've come to more of a middle way position on that now. So, like Evan Thompson, in his stuff now, he's kind of charted that out, and he actually pushed back on Buddhism. I don't know if that's the entire reason he did it, but he said, "Why I'm not a Buddhist." He published a book on that. I think it had a little bit to do with that. But anyway, he's definitely got this middle way position on that, which I guess is kind of philosophical. It's not exactly in therapy, but I guess the general principle would just be, you know, if you want to honor the other human being, you know, see their relative self as relatively real. Right?
So there's the self, no self dualism.
Yeah.
But there's also a kind of, maybe we could call it east-west dualism around emotion, where this tradition that Freud opened up for us tells us that we have these emotions we need to deal with somehow, whether we notice them or not. But then there's this sort of neuro-Buddhist tradition where your emotions are just what your brain cultivates. So on the one hand, people say, go into those emotions, explore them, figure out what they are, change your relationship to them. And the other approach is, no, you're just empowering them by doing that. Practice having the feelings you want to have. So how do you hold the balance between those two approaches?
Well, I like that too. Practice feelings, that it would be, okay, so then that would be more like the Buddhist perspective, if that is the full Buddhist perspective, be more like positive psychology. And so we can do that, and, you know, call that flourishing. And Ken is framing that within what he calls the positive side of cleaning up is flourishing. It's not fully developmental, but you can just cultivate positive states like gratefulness, right? For example, and forgiveness, and those which are wonderful. That's something to do. Like I've got my gratitude app, and, you know, try to do that. And then, okay, but I'm not making a connection here somehow, so I've disconnected a little bit. Where were we going? That you were saying?
The relationship between like that Freudian approach and that cultivation.
Yeah. I think anger is a piece that's in terms of, so Dalai Lama kind of proscription against anger, right? Some of the Buddhist stuff is like, if you have an angry outburst, you know, that's like 10,000 years of your good karma is lost in that one moment. That's a pretty severe, that's a pretty intense injunction against anger. Like, wow. But that would be, I guess, where the Dalai Lamas come from, Shantideva, and maybe the Eastern cultures were very focused on the collective well-being, and anger can really disrupt that pretty quickly. So yeah, I would guess, I would say that it would come down to how are we going to work with anger? How are we going to best do that? And there is, an integral therapist, Robert Masters, who did a whole dissertation on anger. And he goes through a developmental model of working with anger. And I have worked as an anger management specialist, but it's a complex and challenging, state to work with. And what he says is that, kind of at the first level of development, you tend to get a dualism between stuffing it or acting it out, right? So people are kind of like either hurting somebody or they're hurting themselves, right? Then the second stage would be mindfulness of anger. So I think that's good. So you just feel it all, right? Don't stuff it, don't act it out. That would probably, and then he goes on, he thinks there's kind of something he calls a heart anger, which would be sort of, I guess, anger is our moral emotion. So there is a place for anger as our moral emotion to, response to injustice. So that would be social justice warrior kind of anger. For me, that's a hard, I'm not entirely happy with that. I'm not entirely comfortable with that. I grew up in a spiritual community, like some of that spiritual stuff around anger, being really careful about anger, sort of, I still believe that. Yeah.
We certainly need to be careful around the way we express it, but the question of whether some of our emotions are invalid in some way or whether they're all valid is a really interesting question. Like some of them could be flip sides or shadow sides or distortions of our real emotions, or we could just say everything we feel is legitimate, which is good therapeutically, but the danger of that is a kind of emotional narcissism where we don't apply any intentionality to be a better person.
Yeah. I think the postmodern therapy world is trying to work that out, what you just said there, because therapeutically it's better, in a sense, usually typically better to just allow all the emotions to be there. But if there's no moral intentionality to become a better person, that can be an issue for sure. And again, I think it goes back to, can we recognize kind of complex trauma stuff on the narcissistic side of the street when it's there? And I would say it shows up, and it does show up in social. I'm noticing it in social justice now, where basically someone's using a Darvo tactic, and even some integral informed psychologists not recognizing that it's Darvo tactic, but it's in a social justice frame, and it's like, oh yeah, it's just social justice. And well, no, that's actually psychological abuse. This person is punching you in the face psychologically, and then saying that they're doing that because it's for social justice, for your own good. For your own good, white guy.
Only hitting you because I love you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just dial that back. If this was your child, if you were parenting, right, maybe you'd say this for your own good. We're kind of growing out of that now. We don't really go for that. That's probably not for their own good.
You mentioned this guy who's creating a kind of developmental hierarchy of how we process anger. And at the bottom level is hurting yourself or hurting someone else.
Right.
What's the deal with hurting yourself? To what degree is self-destruction an actual part of our psychology?
Well, I think it's a pathology. Pathology. I mean, I think it's an unhelpful part. It's we've internalized, a punitive aspect, with a very strong inner critic or self-punishing voice. So within a voice dialogue frame, you could say that there's some very punishing, and there's people who assess that and work with that, particularly for those really hard ones like the suicidality. Or I haven't worked a lot with cutting and self-harming like that, but would be in the same kind of level.
Is there a problem of, I'm curious about this, a difficulty in empathizing with the part of ourself or the internalized role that's doing the attacking, doing the critiquing? Because there's an interesting piece in Nietzsche somewhere where he says, when we're hard on ourselves, when we attack ourselves, we have a discussion as if we were the one who was getting attacked, but we don't empathize with the one who's doing the attacking. We don't connect with the sadistic person who's doing that to us, but that's also us. And so we can't quite put those together because we identify with the victim of self-abuse and not with the abuser of self-abuse.
I didn't know. What did Nietzsche say we should do?
Oh, I don't know. He just he just brings it up and moves on.
These are really good questions, so because I work with this on the ground every day and I'm just feeling my way with it, I guess I try to keep compassion as the foreground, and so if I have this person identify, is this person in a stage in their process where they need to just externalize the critic? It might actually help them to see it as just an invading force and tell the critic to fuck off, to back off, to get out of here. That might be an important stage. There's probably stages to working with the inner critic. And then when they're stronger, right, then they could try taking that critic's perspective. I would say something like that. So the first stage is to externalize the critic, like throw it out of you, because it can also be an introject, right?
Yeah.
And then the second stage, then maybe you would then start to be in the place where then you could move into that critic and play that critic. Be fairly intense. But when you're ready for that, that could be really empowering, because there's a lot of power in there. The critic's coming at that power stage, right? It's kind of a red kind of sub-personality. So you do want to get that power back.
Shadow work is a core element of the intro approach. And in the therapeutic community, there's a dharma, there's a wisdom about shadow work that is not necessarily common in the general public, which is why people go to therapeutic experts. But what I want to know is, what do we not know about that? Like, what is the future of understanding shadow work? Right? Where are the unanswered questions? Where are our approaches not good enough yet? Where should we be looking if we wanted to make shadow work stronger than it is right now?
Yeah, well, I know that just because we're talking about the integral context, like Kim Barta, has made some distinctions, like, in the integral, we do the 3-2-1, kind of voice dialogue thing. But, he says you also need to go 1-2-3. And that's really what I'm getting out of throwing out the interjects, right? So that's stuff that's not yours. So I think sometimes the inner critic is really like an alien invader. Some of the stuff work on that is more like that. Like it's really the anti-self, and so you have to just throw it out. My hunch is that for people working with really difficult states like suicidality and stuff, you just have to you have to look at it that way and throw that inner killer out of your psyche, like get him out of there, or get her out of there, or get it out of there. So very protective of the person.
Right.
And then with somebody who's more stable, like maybe, kind of stably at orange and higher, or maybe even amber and higher, somewhere around there, probably orange, I guess. Actually, we probably should go through this at each level. We probably get this sorted out, but at orange, then the inner critic, you could maybe work with it differently. More just taking Socratically, just take the perspective of the critic, and it wouldn't be overwhelming at that point.
Yeah, I think that's the essence of the modern operating system, is the ability to double check and use polarities. Right?
Yeah.
We see that in the economy, we see it in the justice system and the government, but that's also what it's like to have a modern psyche, to be able to reason, so to speak.
Yeah, and in the early stuff that Ken wrote, it was like the transformations in consciousness stuff. That was the fulcrum. He sort of put like Socratic dialogue was sort of around orange, right? Yeah. For if you can do it for real and not get hijacked by, one of these, victim persecutor things.
Yeah, the boundary between reason and rationalization is pretty fuzzy sometimes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I never rationalize.
What haven't I asked you? What's interesting about integral therapy that hasn't come up? What's exciting? Where do you want to go next?
Covered a lot. I think it's most of the stuff that's relevant for me. I mean, I think this covers it for me in terms of where I'm at.
Well, terrific. Yeah. I think it's such a huge field. I'm going to tell Bruce that this should be the first episode of a series. Integral therapy should be a whole genre of conversations, I think.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I think sometimes, when we look at it as cleaning up, Ken, calls it cleaning up. I don't know. It's a little reductionistic healing, so maybe that's a little bit too green, but I do think that, and I think, again, we see that with Colin Bigelow. He was worked with Ken for 18 years and coming out and saying, hey, I got, some really serious trauma issue to deal with. So yeah, to come for full circle on our conversation, that, that we as an integral community are really building out, fleshing out the healing up, cleaning up aspect of our practice is a good thing. So yeah, if that turns into a series, that would be awesome.
Oh, I'm going to push for it. Thanks for talking to me, Durwin. This is great.
Awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Layman. Thanks so much for taking the time.